She married a billionaire CEO in a contract. When he discovered she was pregnant with his twins, everything changed. I'm pregnant. Twins. From that night after the gala, I'm so sorry, Ledger. I know this wasn't part of the agreement. I know this complicates everything, and Those words would obliterate a contract worth millions and a life constructed brick by brick on the foundation of emotional isolation. But let's pull back to where this actually begins. Because 7 months before Marlo Sinclair would stand in her kitchen confessing the impossible truth that would rewrite both their futures, she sat in a lawyer's office with hands that trembled so violently she could barely hold the pen, about to sign away half a year of her existence to a man whose face she'd never seen in person. Welcome back to Mr. Sterling's Secrets of Love. May heaven wrap every soul listening in a fortress of courage, so unbreakable that fear becomes powerless in your presence, in wisdom that illuminates your path when darkness closes in from every side, in a heart overflowing with hope so fierce that despair cannot take root. May your spirit soar beyond every ceiling built to contain you. Your faith remain diamond strong when the world says break. Your joy flow like rivers that never run dry no matter the season. May every locked door recognize your arrival and swing wide. Every burden pressing down on you transform into strength, lifting you higher. Every tear you've shed become water for seeds of victory growing beneath the surface. You are the pulse of resilience that refuses to stop beating. The flame that darkness cannot extinguish, no matter how hard the winds blow. The living proof that love conquers what logic declares impossible. May your life become a refuge where peace makes its home. Your path be guided by light that never dims. Your every step echo with purpose that reshapes the world. Before we dive into this story, if you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, do it now. This is Mission 1000 Likes, for courage, for hope, for the unstoppable power of love that rewrites destinies. If your heart beats fierce, if your soul knows that loyalty runs deeper than contracts, drop a comment saying, "My heart believes in real love." Now, let this beautiful journey begin. The mahogany desk stretching between them might as well have been an ocean, vast and uncrossable. Ledger Hollingsworth's attorney, a silver-haired woman whose calculating eyes suggested she'd witnessed 1,000 similar transactions, each one rendering love and commitment into mere business arrangements, slid the papers across the polished surface with movements so practiced they seemed choreographed. Her manicured nails, painted the color of dried blood, tapped rhythmically against page 12 like a judge's gavel announcing sentence. "This section outlines the termination clause," the attorney explained, her voice carrying all the warmth of a morgue in winter. 6 months from the wedding date, precisely to the day, the marriage dissolves automatically. Miss Sinclair receives her agreed-upon compensation via wire transfer within 48 hours. Mr. Sinclair, Hollingsworth secures his inheritance per the stipulations in his grandmother's will. Clean break. 0 complications. 0 entanglements moving forward. Marlo's eyes moved across the words, but her brain refused to process the legal terminology that transformed something sacred, marriage, partnership, the joining of 2 lives into clauses about dissolution timelines and financial compensation structures. She'd never once in her 31 years imagined her wedding would involve non-disclosure agreements and wire transfer schedules and attorneys who discussed her future like she was absent from the room entirely. Across from her, separated by that impossible expanse of mahogany and paperwork and vastly different life experiences, Ledger Hollingsworth radiated the particular brand of controlled power that only comes from building a billion-dollar commercial real estate empire before his 35th birthday. His charcoal suit, some Italian designer whose name Marlo wouldn't recognize even if spoken aloud, probably carried a price tag exceeding her entire previous year's rent. His watch, a sleek Swiss thing with complications she couldn't begin to understand, definitely did. He sat with the ramrod posture of someone who'd never questioned a single major decision in his adult life, fingers steepled beneath a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite, watching her with steel-gray eyes that revealed absolutely nothing about what thoughts moved behind them. "Any questions?" His voice carried that clipped, economical efficiency characteristic of people accustomed to meetings measured in 15-minute increments, people who scheduled their entire existence around productivity metrics and expected everyone else to maintain the same ruthless pace. Marlo had approximately 1,000 questions crowding her throat. Why her specifically, when he could have selected literally anyone from his own social stratosphere? Why construct this bizarre arrangement instead of simply hiring an actress to play the role? What particular brand of damage creates a man who reduces marriage, something that should involve love, commitment, mutual vulnerability, to another business deal requiring legal protection from emotional complications? But her throat felt constricted, closed around words too big to emerge, and what finally escaped was something far simpler, far more desperately human in its concern. What do I tell people? My friends? My family? What story am I supposed to give them about how we met? Something flickered in those steel-gray eyes. Loneliness, perhaps, or regret, or some deep reservoir of isolation that all his billions couldn't fill, couldn't fix, couldn't even acknowledge properly before his expression shuddered with the finality of prison doors slamming closed. When he spoke again, his voice carried that smooth, well-rehearsed quality that suggested he'd prepared these answers long before she'd walked through the door to ask the questions. Tell them whatever narrative makes you comfortable maintaining. The story I'm utilizing publicly is that we met at a charity gala approximately 3 months ago and connected over mutual interests in literature and architectural preservation. Simple enough, believable to outsiders, easy to maintain consistently across different social contexts. But I've never attended a charity gala in my entire life, Marlowe protested, feeling the walls of this arrangement closing in around her like a room gradually filling with water. Ledger pulled out his phone without missing a single beat, thumbs moving across the screen with the frightening speed of someone who conducted half their existence in digital space, whose life was so integrated with technology that the boundary between human and device had blurred into near invisibility. You have now. My assistant will send you photographic documentation from last month's Kensington Foundation event within the hour. We'll establish that as our meeting location. She'll also schedule you with an image consultant first thing tomorrow morning. You'll require appropriate wardrobe for public appearances as my wife. The marriage needs to appear completely legitimate in every observable detail to outside scrutiny. The casual efficiency with which he orchestrated her complete transformation, her clothing, her backstory, her entire fabricated history with him made Marlowe's stomach twist with something that felt uncomfortably adjacent to prostitution. Selling herself, just with more paperwork and higher compensation. But then her mind conjured the image of Sinclair books, sharp and painful as a knife between her ribs. The century-old independent bookstore her grandfather had built from absolute nothing during an era when black business owners faced obstacles that would have crushed lesser spirits. Its shelves lined with first editions and local history collections and rare volumes that drew collectors from 3 states away. Its creaking wooden floors that had supported 3 generations of readers discovering worlds beyond their immediate circumstances. The building now drowning, literally drowning in debt, so crushing that Marlowe woke gasping from nightmares about it. Her father's cancer treatment, extending across 2 brutal years, had consumed everything, every penny of savings. Every safety net carefully constructed over decades. Every backup plan her grandparents had established. The medical bills had arrived in waves that kept crashing long after he died, each envelope another piece of her family's legacy being sold to pay for procedures that ultimately hadn't saved him anyway. The auction was scheduled for 8 weeks from today. Exactly 56 days until strangers would walk through those doors her grandfather had installed with his own hands and turn her family's legacy into whatever generated maximum profit: a yoga studio, a coffee chain franchise, luxury condos, or complete demolition to sell the land beneath. This money, this arrangement, this bargain she was making with a beautiful devil wearing Italian suits and Swiss watches represented their only remaining lifeline. The difference between preservation and obliteration. The pen felt impossibly heavy in her hand, heavier than any pen should feel, as though it were constructed from something denser than metal and ink, constructed from consequences she couldn't fully envision yet, from futures she couldn't predict, from paths diverging in directions she couldn't see from her current vantage point. She glanced up one final time at Ledger, searching desperately for something recognizably human beneath all that corporate armor he wore like a second skin. He met her gaze steadily, and for just one heartbeat so brief she might have imagined it, she could have sworn she detected understanding flickering in those gray depths, as though he knew exactly what this cost her. As though maybe, just possibly, it cost him something too, something he'd never acknowledge aloud, because acknowledgement would require vulnerability he'd trained himself out of years ago. Her signature flowed across the bottom of the final page in the cursive her grandmother had taught her during long summer visits decades ago, back when life felt simpler and futures felt more certain. Strange and unsettling how the same handwriting could sign birthday cards for people you loved and simultaneously sign away 6 months of your life to a stranger. Marlo Sinclair, written in loops and flourishes that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else entirely, someone braver or more foolish or more desperate than she wanted to believe herself capable of being. The attorney collected the papers with mechanical precision, suggesting she'd performed this exact action hundreds of times, sliding them into a leather folder that probably cost more than Marlo's car back when her car still functioned before it died 2 weeks ago, adding transportation to the growing list of problems money was supposed to solve. "Congratulations," the attorney said, though the word emerged completely devoid of anything resembling actual congratulation. "The wedding ceremony is scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. Courthouse location, private ceremony. Mr. Hollingsworth's driver will collect you at 1:30 sharp. Please be ready." Friday. That timeline landed in Marlo's awareness, like a stone dropping into still water. 72 hours away. 3 days until she became Mrs. Ledger Hollingsworth. At least on paper. At least for 6 months. At least until the inheritance cleared and she received her compensation, and they could both walk away from this arrangement as though it had never happened, as though they could simply erase 6 months of cohabitation and legal marriage like deleting a file. Except some things that happen can't be undone, can't be erased, can't be walked away from cleanly no matter what the contract specifies. Some signatures change you in ways no amount of money can possibly reverse. Marlo didn't know this, yet couldn't have known it. Wouldn't have believed it if someone had pulled her aside to warn her. But the real cost of that contract wouldn't be the 6 months of her life she was trading. It would be her heart, her certainty about who she was. Every protective wall she'd constructed to keep herself safe from wanting things she couldn't have, from hoping for futures that seemed impossible for someone like her. As she stood to leave, gathering her worn purse and second-hand coat that marked her so obviously as not belonging in spaces like this, Ledger spoke for only the second time since she'd entered the office. Marlo. Just her name, but the way he pronounced it with unexpected gentleness, with something that sounded almost like regret, made her pause with her hand already on the door handle. She turned back to face him, this stranger she was about to marry, this man who'd reduced something sacred and ancient into a business transaction complete with termination clauses. He wasn't looking at her anymore. His gaze had dropped to his hands, and for the first time since she'd walked into this office, he looked almost uncertain, almost vulnerable, almost human beneath all that carefully maintained composure. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words emerging rough around the edges as though they hurt coming out. "For agreeing to this. I know, it's not conventional." She turned back fully to look at him, really look at him, seeing past the expensive suit and the corporate armor to something wounded underneath. Why me? Why me? The question finally broke free from where it had been lodged in her throat since this bizarre arrangement first began. You could have chosen anyone. Someone already existing in your world. Someone who understands your life. Someone who wouldn't look so obviously out of place at charity galas and board meetings. Ledger remained silent for so long that Marlo thought he might not answer at all, might simply let her leave, with that question hanging unanswered in the air between them. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its corporate polish, becoming something rawer, more honest than anything he'd said in this entire meeting. Because everyone in my world would want more than 6 months. They'd see the contract as a beginning, not an end. A loophole to exploit. A way in. He met her eyes again, and the vulnerability there was almost painful to witness. But you signed those papers like you were already counting down the days until you could leave. Like freedom mattered more than money. I needed someone who wouldn't want to stay. Someone who wouldn't try to make this into something it can't be. The honesty in that statement was devastating in its bleakness. Here was a man so thoroughly convinced of his own unlovability, so deeply damaged by whatever wounds he carried, that he'd constructed an entire marriage around the guarantee of abandonment, around ensuring that the person he legally bound himself to was already planning their escape before they'd even begun. Marlo wanted to say something, to challenge that grim certainty, to argue that maybe he deserved more than contractual relationships and predetermined endings. But what could she possibly offer? She was literally taking his money to save a bookstore. She was planning her exit strategy before she'd even moved in. Maybe they deserved each other, two people, so afraid of hoping for anything real that they'd rather construct elaborate legal fictions than risk actual vulnerability. The 3 days until the wedding passed in a disorienting blur of unreality. The image consultant, a terrifyingly efficient woman named Francesca who looked at Marlowe's wardrobe like an archaeologist examining primitive tools, transformed her closet into something utterly unrecognizable. Designer labels she'd only glimpsed in magazines now hung beside her thrift store finds like artifacts from incompatible civilizations, dresses that cost what Marlowe used to make in a month, shoes she was genuinely afraid to walk in, a leather jacket so buttery soft it felt like touching clouds, with a price tag that made her physically nauseous when she accidentally saw it. Celeste, Ledger's assistant, a brisk woman in her 50s who seemed to anticipate his needs before he expressed them, who moved through the world with the quiet competence of someone who'd spent decades making powerful people's lives function smoothly, ran Marlowe through their backstory until she could recite their fictional first meeting in her sleep, until the lie felt more solid than some of her actual memories. They'd locked eyes across the Kensington Foundation ballroom during the annual preservation fundraiser. She'd been wearing emerald green, though in reality Marlowe had been in her cramped apartment that night, eating Thai takeout straight from the container and reading Austen for probably the 100th time, finding comfort in stories where love eventually conquered obstacles. He'd approached her during the silent auction, making some witty comment about the overvalued painting they were both examining. They talked for hours about the importance of preserving historical buildings, about how every structure tells stories if you know how to listen, about the soul that old things carry that new construction can never quite replicate. By the end of the evening, he'd asked for her number with an uncharacteristic nervousness she'd found endearing. They'd been inseparable ever since, drawn together by shared passion for preservation and a connection that felt inevitable. The lie was so thoroughly polished, so meticulously detailed, complete with specific conversations and shared jokes and meaningful looks, that Marlowe started to almost believe it herself during the repetitions, started to imagine what it would have been like if their story had actually unfolded that way. If she'd actually been the kind of woman who wore emerald green to charity galas and could discuss architectural preservation with billionaires as equals. If he'd actually been the kind of man who asked strangers to dance and talked about souls and stories instead of profit margins and development deals and quarterly returns. But Friday arrived with brutal, unforgiving efficiency, and reality had no space for fairy tales or wishful thinking. The courthouse was a brutalist concrete building that looked like it had been designed by someone who genuinely believed beauty was inefficient, that form should serve, function, and nothing more. All sharp angles and gray surfaces, and windows like blank eyes staring out at the city. Ledger's driver, a quiet man named James, who'd said perhaps 5 words total during their previous interactions, pulled up to a side entrance where photographers couldn't see, where their transaction could remain private. Even this fake wedding, this legal fiction, had to be protected from the wrong kind of attention, from questions neither of them wanted to answer. Marlowe wore a simple cream dress she'd owned for years, one of the few items that had survived Francesca's wardrobe purge. It wasn't white that felt like too much of a lie, like claiming something sacred when this was purely transactional, but it was appropriate enough, modest, the kind of thing someone might wear to a small, intimate ceremony between people who actually loved each other. She'd left her hair down because the stylist's elaborate updo had made her look like someone else entirely, and she needed to hold on to herself, somehow through this. Needed to maintain some thread of connection to who she'd been before this bizarre arrangement rewrote her existence. Ledger was already there when she arrived, standing in the hallway outside the judge's chambers, with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking almost uncomfortable in the space. He dressed down for the occasion if you could call a perfectly tailored suit worth thousands. Dressing down, no tie, top button undone, hair slightly less rigidly controlled than usual, like he was trying to look less like a CEO about to acquire a profitable company and more like an actual human being about to get married. When he saw her emerge from the elevator, he straightened immediately, and something crossed his face that Marlowe couldn't quite read. Appreciation? Nervousness? Relief that she'd actually shown up? He opened his mouth like he was about to say something, then closed it again, apparently thinking better of whatever words had almost emerged. settling instead for a nod that conveyed precisely nothing about what he might be feeling beneath that carefully maintained exterior. "Ready?" he asked, his voice carrying none of its usual commanding certainty. No, Marlowe thought with crystal clarity. Absolutely not. But she nodded anyway, because what choice did she have? The bookstore, her grandfather's legacy. 56 days until auction. She repeated these facts like a mantra, like justification, like absolution for what she was about to do. The ceremony itself took less than 10 minutes from start to finish. The judge, an older man with kind eyes, who'd probably performed thousands of weddings in this exact room over his decades on the bench, read from a standard script with all the passion of someone reading a grocery list. The words that should have meant something, should have carried weight and significance and promise, fell flat in the sterile space. Do you, Ledger, take this woman? Do you, Marlowe, take this man? In sickness and health, though that clause didn't apply here. Not really. For richer or poorer, though they'd already settled the financial arrangements with lawyers and contracts. Till death do you part, though the paperwork upstairs specified 6 months to the day, not a lifetime. 2 strangers served as witnesses. Random people pulled from the hallway where they'd been waiting for their own legal proceedings, a divorce hearing, ironically, who looked moderately bored by the whole affair, like this was just another mundane task to check off their list before getting back to their real lives, their actual problems. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, with the same inflection he might use to declare court in recess, Ledger leaned in to kiss her. His lips touched hers for exactly 2 seconds, Marlowe counted, her heart hammering so violently she was certain everyone in the room could hear it, like drums announcing disaster before he pulled away. It felt mechanical, perfunctory, obligatory, like signing another piece of paper, just with their mouths instead of pens, like checking off a box on a form, like anything except what a first married kiss should feel like. Congratulations, the judge said, already gathering his papers for whatever appointment came next, already moving on because their marriage was just another file, another case number, another completed transaction in his endless queue. You may collect your marriage certificate from the clerk's office downstairs. Best wishes to you both. And just like that, in less time than it took to watch a sitcom episode, Marlowe Sinclair became Marlowe Hollingsworth. At least on paper. At least for the next 6 months. At least until the contract expired and they could both pretend this had never happened. Could go back to being strangers who'd briefly shared legal documents and living space. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun was blindingly bright after the fluorescent dimness inside, making Marlowe squint painfully as her eyes adjusted. Ledger's driver James waited at the curb beside a midnight blue Bentley that probably cost more than most people made in a decade, maybe 2. The door was already open, a small luxury that emphasized just how dramatically different her life was about to become from anything she'd known before. Before she could climb into that expensive car and cross into her new temporary existence, Ledger caught her elbow gently, his touch surprisingly warm through the thin fabric of her dress. "I had your belongings moved to the penthouse this morning," he said, and Marlowe could hear him trying to make his voice sound casual, matter of fact, like this was perfectly normal. "I hope that's all right. I thought it would be easier than trying to coordinate around both our schedules later." Marlowe blinked, thrown by this information landing on top of everything else. "You moved my things? Already? Without asking me first?" "The contract begins today," he pointed out, which was technically true but felt somehow beside the point. No reason to delay implementation. "Your old apartment lease has been paid through the end of the year, in case you need to access anything or want to maintain it as a space of your own. But for the next 6 months, you'll need to be living with me for appearances. The marriage has to look legitimate to outside observers, especially given the scrutiny around the inheritance." Right. Appearances. The marriage had to look real, had to withstand investigation, which meant she couldn't maintain her cramped studio above the bookstore where she'd lived for the past 6 years. She had to relocate to his world, inhabit his space, wear his clothes, or clothes he'd paid for, which amounted to the same thing. Play his wife convincingly enough to fool board members and lawyers and whoever else might be watching. She'd known this intellectually when she signed the contract, but the reality of it, her entire life packed up and relocated without her consent or participation, suddenly felt overwhelming in a way the abstract concept hadn't. The drive through the city felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold through a car window. Marlowe watched familiar streets give way to increasingly expensive neighborhoods, the buildings growing taller and sleeker, the people on the sidewalks better dressed, until they reached the kind of exclusive high-rises that had doormen in uniforms and private elevators and names like the Residences at Park Avenue or the Carlyle. Ledger's building was all glass and steel and clean lines, reflecting the afternoon sky like a mirror, like it belonged more to clouds than earth. The doorman greeted Ledger by name, "Welcome home, Mr. Hollingsworth," and offered Marlowe a polite nod that suggested he'd been briefed on her arrival and trained not to ask questions. The elevator to the penthouse required a special key to access. Of course it did. Ledger inserted it with the casual ease of long practice, pressed the button for the top floor, and they rose in silence that felt heavier than physics could account for. Marlowe's ears popped as they climbed, the pressure differential a physical reminder of how high up they were going, how far from ground level, how removed from the world she knew. "Listen," Ledger said as the numbers climbed past 20, past 30, past 40. "I want to be transparent about the living arrangements. The master bedroom is yours. It's significantly larger, has the better view, more closet space. I'll take the guest suite on the opposite end." "You don't have to do that," Marlowe started to protest, but he cut her off with a gesture. "It's a 14,000 square foot space," he said. And Marlowe tried to comprehend that number, tried to imagine an apartment larger than most houses. "We'll rarely cross paths if we don't want to. I'm typically at the office by 6, most mornings. Rarely home before 10 or 11 at night. Weekends, I usually work from my study. The housekeeper, Patricia, stocks the kitchen on Tuesdays and Fridays. If you need anything adjusted food preferences, schedule changes, whatever, contact her directly. Her information will be on the refrigerator." He was laying out the parameters of their cohabitation like he was explaining the terms of a lease agreement. Everything organized, compartmentalized, designed to minimize actual interaction. No room for messiness or spontaneity or the kind of gradual intimacy that develops when people actually share space. Marlowe should have felt relieved. Wasn't this exactly what she'd signed up for? A business arrangement with clear boundaries? But instead she felt a strange hollowness settling in her chest, a loneliness she hadn't anticipated. The elevator doors opened directly into the penthouse, and Marlowe forgot how to breathe. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the entire space like the building itself was trying to dissolve into sky, offering views of the city that looked like something from a movie about lives she'd never touch. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber and rose that made even the concrete and glass of the cityscape look almost magical. The furniture was aggressively modern, all clean lines and neutral colors, arranged with the kind of precision that suggested an expensive interior designer rather than someone who actually lived here and moved things around based on comfort or habit. Abstract art hung on white walls, the kind of pieces that probably had names and significance Marlowe didn't have the education to understand, that probably cost more than her bookstore made in a year. Everything was gray and white and chrome, beautiful in a cold, untouchable way, like a museum exhibit titled, "How Rich People Live." "There's a home automation system for everything," Ledger continued, pulling out his phone to show her an app with more controls than seemed necessary for a residence. Climate control, lighting, security, window treatments, music throughout. I'll have my IT person add your access credentials tomorrow. Kitchen is fully stocked. Patricia's very good about anticipating needs. There's a gym on this level, pool on the roof deck, office space over there if you need a place to work, on bookstore business. He was giving her a tour like she was a guest, checking into an upscale hotel, not his wife moving into their shared home. Marlowe walked slowly through the space, her footsteps echoing slightly on the hardwood floors, trying to find anything personal. A photograph of family or friends. A book left casually on a table with a bookmark partway through. A jacket thrown over the back of a chair. A coffee mug left in the sink. Anything that suggested a human being with habits and preferences and a life actually lived here rather than just using it as a place to sleep between work commitments. She found nothing, not a single personal item. The space looked like a showroom, perfectly styled but completely sterile. It made Marlowe's chest ache in a way she couldn't fully articulate. "Where's the guest suite?" she asked finally, her voice sounding small in all that expensive emptiness. Ledger gestured toward a hallway leading off to the right, east wing, Your room is west wing, opposite end of the penthouse. Maximum privacy for us both. Of course. Maximum privacy. Maximum distance. Because heaven forbid they accidentally develop any actual familiarity with each other. Any comfort or ease that might complicate the clean termination in 6 months. Marlowe followed him down the west hallway, passing several closed doors she assumed were closets or storage, until he pushed open double doors at the end to reveal a bedroom that was genuinely larger than her entire previous apartment had been. Her belongings looked almost comically out of place here. Her 2 worn suitcases sat on an upholstered bench at the foot of a bed that could easily sleep 4 people, probably more. Her boxes of books, at least a dozen of them, her most precious possessions carefully packed, were stacked neatly against one wall, looking shabby and small against the designer furnishings. The walk-in closet visible through an open door beyond was bigger than her old bedroom had been, and someone had already unpacked her clothes. Her thrift store finds and Target basics hung beside the designer pieces from Francesca's shopping spree, the contrast between them almost painful, a visual representation of the gap between her world and Ledger's. The ensuite bathroom was equally overwhelming, heated marble floors, a shower with so many jets and controls it looked like it required an engineering degree to operate, and a soaking tub positioned right beside a floor-to-ceiling window to offer views of the city while bathing. It was objectively stunning. The kind of space Marlowe had only seen in design magazines. It was also the most impersonal, soulless bathroom she'd ever encountered. "If anything doesn't suit your needs, let me know," Ledger said from the doorway, and Marlowe realized he hadn't actually entered the room, was staying carefully on the threshold, like there was an invisible force field he couldn't cross. "I want you to be comfortable here. This is your home for the next 6 months. "It's beautiful," Marlowe said honestly. Because it was, objectively. "Thank you for all of this." An awkward silence stretched between them, filling the enormous bedroom with tension. They were married now, as of approximately 45 minutes ago. Legally bound to each other. Living in the same home. And yet, they might as well have been strangers passing on the street for all the actual connection or understanding between them. "Well," Ledger finally said, and Marlowe noticed him check his watch in a gesture that seemed automatic. A habitual escape mechanism. "I have some calls I need to make before the Asian markets open. Take your time settling in, exploring the space. I'll order dinner around 8 if that works for your schedule. There's a Thai place that delivers, or Italian, or pretty much anything you might want." 8 is fine," Marlowe said. "Whatever you choose is good." He nodded, already half turned away, already retreating toward his side of the penthouse, and whatever work awaited him there. "Thai it is, then. Patricia left menus in the kitchen if you want to look through options later." And then he was gone, disappearing down the hallway, leaving Marlowe completely alone in her beautiful prison. She stood there for a long moment, surrounded by luxury she'd never dreamed of inhabiting, and felt more isolated than she'd ever felt in her cramped studio above the bookstore. At least there, surrounded by the smell of old paper and binding glue and coffee from the shop downstairs, she'd been herself. At least there, she'd belonged. Here, in this perfect space, with its perfect furnishings and perfect views, she felt like a poorly made copy of a person, like she was playing a role she'd never auditioned for and didn't know the lines to. Her phone buzzed in her purse, startling her out of the spiral of her thoughts. A text from her brother Sterling. "How'd it go? Are you officially Mrs. Billionaire now? Call me when you can. Want to make sure you're okay." Marlowe stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the keyboard, trying to figure out what to say. How to explain what she'd just done, the choice she'd just made, the life she'd just walked into. Finally, she typed back something simple. "All official. I'm fine. We'll call tomorrow when I'm more settled. Love you." She didn't trust herself to say more right now. Didn't want to hear the worry in Sterling's voice. Didn't want to try to explain something she barely understood herself. She'd saved the bookstore, or would once the money transferred. That's what mattered. That's what she had to keep telling herself. 6 months of living in a stranger's home, playing a stranger's wife, wearing a stranger's ring, was a small price to pay for preserving their grandfather's legacy. For keeping alive the space he'd built with his own hands, the dream he'd refused to let racism and economic hardship kill. Wasn't it? Marlowe unpacked her books first, needing them more than clothes or toiletries, needing their familiar weight and smell and the comfort they'd always provided. She lined them up on the built-in shelves that ran along one wall of the bedroom, Austen and the Brontes, Morrison and Baldwin, Angelou and Hooks. Her entire beloved collection of voices that had kept her company through lonelier times, like sentries guarding what was left of her former life, like anchors keeping her tethered to who she'd been before this arrangement, rewrote her existence. Then she hung up her clothes beside the designer pieces, her hands shaking slightly as she did, trying not to think about what it meant that her entire wardrobe could be purchased with what one of those dresses probably cost. Trying not to think about how easily money could transform surfaces while leaving everything underneath unchanged. She was still herself, she told herself firmly. Still Marlo Sinclair, no. Marlo Hollingsworth now, at least on paper, at least for 6 months. The name felt foreign on her tongue, like trying on someone else's identity. Finally, she sat on the edge of that enormous bed, designer silk duvet beneath her fingers, feeling nothing like the worn cotton she was used to, and stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city spreading out below her like a carpet of lights beginning to twinkle on as dusk deepened into evening. From up here, 40 stories above the street, everything looked small and manageable and distant. The problems of real people seemed far away, abstract, easy to forget. Marlo wondered if that was how Ledger saw the world all the time, from such a height that individual struggles became invisible, that human complexity reduced to numbers on spreadsheets and buildings on skylines. She wondered if 6 months in this beautiful isolation would change her too, would smooth away her sharp edges in desperate circumstances until she became as polished and empty as these perfect rooms. She wondered if the price she was paying was actually higher than she'd calculated when she signed those papers. Sometimes the hardest stories to hear are the ones that mirror our own desperate choices. The moments we trade pieces of ourselves for things we tell ourselves matter more. If this is stirring something uncomfortable in your chest right now, stay with me, because Marlo's about to discover that walls built for protection can become prisons, and contracts designed to prevent complications have a way of creating exactly what they're meant to prevent. The first month in the penthouse passed in a strange, disorienting routine of isolation, punctuated by brief, awkward encounters. Marlo rarely saw Ledger, and when she did, it felt more like sharing space with a polite ghost than a husband. True to his word, he was gone before she woke. Most mornings she'd hear the elevator at some ungodly hour, confirming he'd left for the office while darkness still pressed against the windows. He returned long after she'd eaten dinner alone, after she'd given up waiting for him, usually close to midnight based on the elevator sounds that woke her from restless sleep. On the rare occasions their paths did cross her, making coffee in the gleaming kitchen at sunrise, him grabbing bottled water from the refrigerator after midnight workouts in the home gym, they exchanged polite nods, like distant acquaintances who happened to be sharing an elevator. Surface pleasantries. Good morning. How was your day? Fine. Thank you. Never anything deeper. Never anything real. He never asked about the bookstore or how she was adjusting. She never asked about his work or why he felt the need to bury himself in it so completely. The contract between them was working exactly as designed. Clean, transactional, utterly free of complications or emotional entanglement. Marlo filled her days with work, throwing herself into the bookstore's operations remotely, video calling with her assistant manager Keisha to oversee inventory and plan events, updating the website, processing online orders, doing anything to feel connected to the part of her life that still felt real. The loan had processed within days of the wedding. Ledger's lawyers were terrifyingly efficient, and the immediate crisis was averted, the building saved from auction. But running the business from 40 stories up, surrounded by luxury while her employees dealt with leaking pipes and temperamental heating systems, left Marlo feeling disconnected in a way she'd never experienced before. She worked out in the home gym, though using equipment that probably cost more than her car felt absurd. She swam laps in the rooftop pool, the water heated to perfect temperature year-round. The views of the city sprawling around her, both breathtaking and isolating, beautiful to look at, impossible to touch. She walked the enormous penthouse like a ghost haunting someone else's life, exploring rooms that clearly served no purpose except to fill space in a residence too large for one person, let alone two people actively avoiding each other. Patricia, the housekeeper, was kind but professional, asking no questions about the strange arrangement, simply ensuring the refrigerator stayed stocked with foods Marlo liked. Somehow she'd learned Marlo's preferences without ever directly asking, that fresh towels appeared in her bathroom, that the space remained immaculately clean without Marlo ever seeing the actual work happen. It was like living in a very expensive hotel where all your needs were anticipated but you never quite felt at home. The loneliness was profound in a way Marlowe hadn't expected. She'd been alone before, living solo above the bookstore, going days without substantive human contact beyond customer transactions. But this felt different, heavier. This was loneliness wrapped in luxury, isolation that should have felt comfortable but instead felt like slowly suffocating on silk sheets. Except she couldn't sleep in that enormous bed, couldn't truly relax in that designer kitchen, couldn't fully breathe in all that sterile perfection. She found herself wandering the penthouse at odd hours when insomnia claimed her, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., searching for something she couldn't name. Something human. Something real. Something that felt less like a stage set and more like a place where actual life happened. That's how she discovered the library on the 48th floor. It was 3 weeks into the marriage, or whatever they were calling this arrangement, when Marlowe, unable to sleep yet again, decided to explore parts of the building she hadn't yet seen. The penthouse itself she knew by now, every impersonal corner of it, but the building had 49 floors, and she'd only ever been to the penthouse level and the lobby. Surely there was something else. Somewhere. She took the elevator down 1 floor to 40, half expecting to find more luxury residences, more people living in expensive isolation. Instead, the hallway was dim and quiet, with unmarked doors suggesting spaces that weren't residences at all. Storage, maybe, or mechanical rooms, or forgotten spaces that served some architectural purpose she didn't understand. At the end of the hallway, she found a door slightly ajar, warm light spilling out into the corridor like an invitation. Marlowe pushed it open and forgot how to breathe. Unlike every other space she'd encountered in this building, all modern minimalism and cold perfection, this room felt alive, warm, breathing. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined every wall, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked like they'd been collected over a lifetime, maybe multiple lifetimes. The furniture here was older, softer wingback chairs, upholstered in worn velvet, the color of red wine. Their arms, showing gentle wear from decades of readers settling in. A Persian rug sprawled across the floor, its intricate patterns faded in places from countless footsteps, but still beautiful, still speaking of craftsmanship from another era. Reading lamps cast warm pools of yellow light instead of the harsh white LEDs everywhere else, creating pockets of coziness that invited you to curl up and stay. The room smelled like paper and leather and dust and time, and Marlowe felt something in her chest unclench. For the first time since she'd signed that contract. This space felt real, felt human, felt like someone had actually loved it instead of just purchasing it. She moved along the shelves, running her fingers over spines, reading titles. First editions of classics she'd only seen in photographs. Rare printings of volumes that would cost thousands if you could even find them. Collections spanning centuries, carefully preserved, organized by some system she couldn't immediately discern, but that suggested deep knowledge and real passion. She pulled out a first edition of Wuthering Heights, her favorite. The book she'd read so many times, her personal copy was held together with tape and hope, and the binding cracked slightly as she opened it, the sound and smell of old pages flooding her with nostalgia. Someone had loved this book, had read it and reread it, had carried it with them through a life that left marks on pages. Marlowe curled up in one of the wingback chairs, pulled a throw blanket over her legs, soft cashmere, worn at the edges and open to the first page. For the first time in a month, she felt like herself again. For the first time since moving into the penthouse, she felt like she could actually breathe. That's where Ledger found her 3 hours later, so absorbed in reading that she didn't hear him enter. I didn't know anyone used this room. Marlowe startled so badly, she nearly dropped the book, her heart leaping into her throat as she looked up to find Ledger standing in the doorway. She'd been so lost in Bronte's Yorkshire moors that returning to reality felt jarring, disorienting. She looked up to find him still in his suit, though his tie had been loosened and his normally immaculate hair was rumpled like he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. He looked different somehow, standing in this warm space, surrounded by old books, more human, more accessible, less like a corporate photograph in an annual report, and more like an actual person who got tired and frustrated and carried weights she couldn't see. "I'm sorry," Marlowe said quickly, starting to close the book. "I didn't know this space was private. The door was open, and I couldn't sleep, and it's fine." Ledger moved into the room, and Marlowe watched his entire body language change as he crossed the threshold. His shoulders dropped slightly. His jaw unclenched. His fingers trailed along the book spines as he walked past the shelves, not with the casual gesture of someone touching decoration, but with the reverence of someone who knew these books, loved them, understood their weight and worth and the worlds they contained. My grandmother collected these, spent 40 years hunting down first editions, rare printings, books with history. When she died, I didn't have the heart to sell the collection or donate it to a museum where they'd sit behind glass. So I bought this building specifically because it had this space, kept her library intact exactly as she'd arranged it. It was the first genuinely personal thing he'd ever shared with Marlowe. The first crack in that corporate armor he wore, so constantly it seemed fused to his skin. She watched him pause at a particular shelf, pulling out a weathered volume with hands that were unexpectedly gentle, almost tender, turning pages like they were precious artifacts that might crumble under rough handling. His entire expression softened in a way that transformed his face from austere and untouchable to something almost vulnerable, almost recognizable as human beneath the wealth and power. "She raised you?" Marlowe asked softly, sensing she was being allowed into territory he usually kept locked away behind walls even thicker than the ones surrounding this building. Ledger opened the book, The Count of Monte Cristo. She could see now. The spine cracked from repeated readings, but his eyes weren't reading the words on the page. They were somewhere else, somewhere painful, somewhere decades in the past. "After my parents died. Car accident, when I was 8. His voice was steady, controlled, but Marlowe heard the old grief beneath it. Still sharp and cutting after all these years, the kind of loss that never fully heals, no matter how much time passes. She used to read to me from these books every night. Said stories were medicine for wounds you couldn't see. Said that every building I'd construct as an adult would be me trying to create something permanent. Something that wouldn't disappear the way people do." The rawness in his voice cracked something open between them, created a space where honesty was possible, where pretense felt harder to maintain than truth, where they could be something other than contractual strangers counting down days until dissolution. "Is that true?" Marlowe asked, clutching the Bronte against her chest like a shield. Ledger's steel-gray eyes met hers directly, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw past the billionaire CEO to the orphaned 8-year-old boy beneath. The one who'd learned far too young that everything permanent could vanish in an instant, that the people you loved most could be taken without warning, without mercy, without any regard for how desperately you still needed them. Probably. She also said I was terrible at letting people in because everyone I'd ever truly loved had left, that I'd rather build walls than bridges, because walls at least stay standing. "She didn't leave by choice," Marlowe whispered, her heart aching for that child he'd been, for the man he'd become, in response to that unbearable loss. No. Ledger closed the book with exquisite care, reverently, like he was handling something sacred that contained more than just printed words, contained memory and love, and the ghost of the only person who'd ever seen him clearly. "She got cancer, fought for 2 years. I was 23, just starting the company, convinced I could build my way to success fast enough to afford better treatments, experimental therapies, anything that might save her. I spent every spare moment at her bedside, and it still wasn't enough time. It's never enough time. When you love someone, you could have centuries, and it wouldn't be enough." He looked around the library with an expression that was part reverence, part grief, and Marlowe understood suddenly why he kept it preserved exactly as it was, why he'd bought an entire building to protect this one space. This wasn't just a collection of books, it was a shrine, a way of holding on to the last person who'd loved him unconditionally, who'd seen past his wealth and ambition to the wounded boy underneath, a way of keeping her alive when everything else had failed. After she died, I decided relationships were liabilities I couldn't afford. Feelings were inefficiencies that only created vulnerabilities. Much cleaner to keep everything transactional, to trade in contracts instead of trust, to ensure that endings were predetermined so they couldn't destroy you when they came. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and unspoken questions. "Is that what we are?" Marlowe wanted to ask. Just another transaction? Another carefully managed liability? But she already knew the answer. They'd literally signed papers defining their relationship in business terms, complete with termination dates and financial compensation structures. What could be clearer than that? That was the agreement we made, Ledger continued, as if reading the question she hadn't voiced aloud. But something in his voice wavered, uncertain for the first time since she'd met him, like maybe he was starting to question the wisdom of his own carefully constructed rules. Like maybe this library, with its warmth and humanity and evidence that love had once existed in his life, was making him remember what he'd deliberately chosen to forget. After that night, something fundamental shifted between them in ways neither could quite articulate or name, in ways that probably violated the spirit, if not the letter, of their contract. Ledger started coming home earlier, not dramatically, not obviously enough to comment on, but present in ways he hadn't been before. 10 o'clock instead of midnight, 9:30 instead of 11, sometimes even 8, appearing in the kitchen while Marlo was eating her solitary dinner, looking almost surprised to find her there, as if he'd forgotten they shared the space. He'd find Marlo in the library almost every evening. She'd claimed it as her sanctuary, the one place in all this expensive square footage where she felt remotely comfortable, and instead of retreating to his study to work as he'd done that first month, he'd pause in the doorway. Then he'd poured 2 glasses of wine from the small bar tucked in the corner. Then he'd sit in the wingback chair opposite hers, close enough to talk but far enough to maintain plausible deniability about intimacy. They talked about books, dissecting characters and themes, with a kind of depth Marlo had rarely found even in her literature courses. About architecture, and she discovered he genuinely loved the craft, saw buildings as stories told in stone and steel. About her grandfather's bookstore and the community it had served for generations, how it had been more than just commerce, it had been sanctuary, refuge, a place where black kids could see themselves in stories when the world tried to make them invisible. About his grandmother's belief that buildings should serve souls, not just house bodies, that good architecture made space for human complexity rather than trying to simplify it away. About how permanence was an illusion, people constructed to feel safe when nothing was truly permanent, how everything eventually crumbled or changed or ended, how the only thing you could control was how much of yourself you'd invested when the end came. About the difference between existing, moving through days, checking boxes, accumulating achievements, and actually living, being present, letting yourself feel things, even when feeling meant risking pain. He never touched her. The contract was explicitly clear about that: no physical relationship, no romantic entanglement, boundaries maintained at all times to ensure clean dissolution. But sometimes their fingers would brush, reaching for the same book, and electricity would arc between them, dangerous, undeniable, the kind of charge that made Marlo's breath catch, and her heart stutter, and her skin feel too tight. Sometimes she'd look up from her reading to find him already watching her with an expression she couldn't fully decipher. Hunger maybe, or curiosity, or longing, or some complicated combination that had no name yet because neither of them had permission to feel it. And she'd wonder if he felt it too. This pull, this possibility, this sense that they were both pretending very hard that something wasn't happening between them, that every evening spent in companionable silence or deep conversation wasn't slowly eroding the walls they'd agreed to maintain. Not everyone can appreciate the complexity of what's happening here. The way connection builds in the spaces between words, in silences shared and glances held a moment too long. The way intimacy can grow without ever being touched, without ever being named. But you understand, don't you? You recognize this dangerous territory, where boundaries become prison bars you start wanting to escape. The contract had 5 more months to run. 153 days, Marlo had counted obsessively that first month, desperate for the time to pass so she could reclaim her life. But now, 7 weeks in, she wasn't counting anymore. Wasn't sure she wanted to count. Wasn't certain she wanted to think too hard about what happened when the clock ran out and she had to walk away from these evening conversations and this unexpected connection and the way Ledger's rare, genuine smile made her chest feel too full. Except Marlo was starting to suspect that forgetting Ledger Hollingsworth, walking away from whatever this was becoming, might not be as simple as legal dissolution and return signatures. Some things leave marks that don't show on paper. 7 weeks into the marriage, into the arrangement, she corrected herself firmly, as if terminology could protect her heart. Something shifted again in the air between them. The pressure building, crackling with potential energy like the atmosphere before a storm. Marlowe could feel it in the way Ledger's gaze lingered a moment too long when she looked up from her book, in the way conversations in the library stretched later into the night. Neither of them quite ready to retreat to opposite wings of the penthouse, in the way silence between them had stopped feeling awkward and started feeling charged with all the things they weren't saying, weren't allowing themselves to acknowledge. Then the invitation arrived for Hollingsworth Holdings' annual anniversary gala. "It's the biggest event of the year," Ledger explained one evening in the library, standing in the doorway rather than sitting as he usually did. His posture tense in a way she'd learned to recognize as discomfort. "Board members, major investors, business press, society photographers, everyone who matters in my world will be there, watching us, looking for cracks in our story, searching for evidence that our marriage is the convenient fiction some of them already suspect it might be." "I know," Marlowe said, though her stomach tightened with anxiety at the thought. One thing to maintain their fiction in private, quite another to perform it under intense scrutiny from people trained to spot weakness and exploit it. That's part of the agreement. Public appearances to maintain legitimacy. "Celeste arranged for your dress to be delivered tomorrow, custom designed based on measurements Francesca sent." He paused, and when Marlowe looked up from her book, she caught something vulnerable flickering in his expression before he could mask it. "I know this isn't what you signed up for. The performance, the scrutiny, playing a role for an audience that's actively hostile. I'm sorry for asking this of you." "It's part of the agreement," Marlowe repeated, but gentler this time. "I understood the terms when I signed. You don't need to apologize for me holding up my end." "Terms?" Ledger's mouth twisted slightly, like the word tasted bitter now, like something that had made perfect sense 2 months ago had soured with time and proximity. "Right, terms." He left before Marlowe could ask what he meant by that tone. What thoughts moved behind those gray eyes that seemed less certain than they'd been at the beginning? The dress arrived the next morning in a garment bag that probably cost more than Marlowe's entire pre-Ledger wardrobe combined. When she unzipped it with trembling fingers, her breath caught painfully. Sapphire silk that seemed to capture light and hold it, shimmering like water, like sky, like every beautiful thing she'd ever seen distilled into fabric. The cut was exquisite, simultaneously elegant and sensual, structured and flowing, designed to transform whoever wore it into someone who belonged in ballrooms and society pages. Someone who belonged with Ledger Hollingsworth. Someone Marlowe still wasn't entirely sure she could convincingly pretend to be. The night of the gala arrived too quickly. Marlowe stood in front of her bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman staring back. The hair and makeup team, Celeste, had sent 3 people who descended on her bedroom like a precision military unit had worked some kind of alchemy, highlighting features she'd never paid much attention to, creating a version of herself that looked polished, sophisticated, expensive. The dress fit perfectly, as though it had been painted on her body rather than merely tailored. She looked like she belonged at a charity gala attended by billionaires. Like she was the kind of woman Ledger Hollingsworth would marry for love, not convenience. For the first time since accepting this arrangement, Marlowe looked in the mirror and saw someone who might actually pull off this deception. When she emerged from her wing of the penthouse, Ledger was waiting by the elevator, scrolling through something on his phone. He'd been looking down, absorbed in whatever was on the screen, but when he heard her footsteps on the marble floor, he glanced up and froze completely. Whatever corporate composure he usually maintained, whatever control he'd mastered over decades of high-stakes negotiations, cracked entirely. His gray eyes darkened to something almost black as they traveled from her face down the length of the dress and back up again, slowly, like he was memorizing every detail, like he'd forgotten how to look away. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough around the edges, stripped of its usual smooth polish. "You look." He stopped, swallowed hard, cleared his throat, and tried again. "That dress is absolutely perfect. Not you're beautiful, not you're stunning, but the way he was looking at her like she'd knocked every coherent thought out of his head, like he was seeing her for the first time, like something fundamental had just shifted in how he perceived her, said everything his carefully chosen words didn't. Something had shifted between them in that moment, standing by the elevator in his sterile penthouse. Some unspoken rule had been bent, if not outright broken. The air felt different, charged, dangerous in ways their contract had been specifically designed to prevent. The car ride to the venue felt entirely unlike their usual silences. Tension hummed between them like a live wire, thick enough to taste, impossible to ignore. Ledger sat on his side of the back seat, maintaining proper distance as always, but Marlowe could feel his awareness of her like heat against her skin, like gravity pulling her towards something she was supposed to resist. The gala itself was overwhelming in exactly the ways Marlowe had feared. A ballroom that looked like something from a historical drama, crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than houses, gilt-edged mirrors reflecting beauty back on itself infinitely, marble floors polished to mirror shine, women in designer gowns that represented small fortunes, dripping with jewelry that required insurance policies, men in custom tuxedos discussing deals worth millions like they were chatting about weather. The kind of wealth that had stopped being about money and become about power, influence, the ability to reshape reality according to preference. Marlowe held on to Ledger's arm and tried to remember how to breathe, tried to remember the backstory they'd rehearsed, until it felt more solid than some actual memories. "Stay close to me," Ledger murmured, his hand covering hers, where it rested in the crook of his elbow, his touch warm and steadying, and breaking at least 3 unspoken rules about maintaining distance. "I'll handle the conversations. You just smile and let me do the talking." And he did. For 3 hours, Ledger guided her through that glittering crowd with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing this his entire adult life, who could navigate these social waters blindfolded. He introduced her to board members whose names she recognized from business news, to investors who controlled funds larger than some countries' GDPs, his hand never leaving the small of her back, the touch proprietary and protective in equal measure. When people asked how they'd met, and everyone asked, curiosity barely masked by politeness, he told their fabricated story with such conviction, such genuine warmth in his voice when he looked at her, that even Marlowe almost believed it. When a particularly pointed older woman made a comment about the surprisingly quick engagement, about marriages that happened faster than seemed quite proper, Ledger pulled Marlowe closer against his side and said simply, "When you know, you know. Why waste time on unnecessary waiting when you've found exactly what you've been looking for?" The lie should have stung, should have felt like mockery of real emotions. Instead, Marlowe found herself desperately wishing it were true, wishing the man speaking those words with such conviction actually meant them. They maintained their professional distance all evening, exactly as the contract specified. Proper space between them, except when photographs required closer proximity. Appropriate touches his hand at her waist, her hand on his arm. Nothing that would suggest they were anything more than a married couple at a business function, nothing that crossed lines into genuine intimacy. But beneath the performance, something else was building. With every glance that held too long, every time Ledger's hand brushed her waist to guide her through the crowd, every time she looked up to find him already watching her with that new intensity in his eyes, every moment they had to stand close enough to feel each other's warmth, and remember that beneath the expensive clothes and practiced smiles, they were just 2 people pretending very hard that something wasn't happening. By the time they climbed back into the car for the ride home, the tension had become almost unbearable, a pressure that needed release. Neither of them spoke. The city lights streaked past the windows like shooting stars, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow and possibility. Marlowe kept her gaze fixed forward, hyper-aware of Ledger sitting 18 inches away, so close, so impossibly far, his presence filling all the space between them, making the air feel too thick to breathe properly. Then, in the darkness of the back seat, hidden from the driver by the privacy screen, he'd raised at some point Marlowe hadn't noticed, she felt his hand find hers. Just that. Nothing more at first. His fingers threading through hers, palm warm and slightly rough against her palm, thumb tracing slow patterns on her wrist that made her breath catch audibly, that made heat pool low in her belly, that made her remember they were supposed to be preventing exactly this kind of intimacy. Not saying anything, not looking at her, just holding her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world, like they did this every day, like the contract didn't explicitly forbid exactly this kind of physical affection that suggested actual emotional connection. "We shouldn't," Marlowe whispered. But even as the words left her mouth, she didn't pull away. Couldn't make herself break the contact, no matter what logic dictated. "The contract says," Ledger began, his voice low and rough, with something that sounded like barely controlled restraint. "Forget the contract." The words hung in the air between them for 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. Then Marlowe turned her head, found Ledger already looking at her with eyes that had gone dark with want, and something deeper, something that looked almost like desperation, and the distance between them evaporated like it had never existed. Their kiss was nothing like the perfunctory, obligatory peck at the courthouse that had sealed their legal fiction. This was desperation and hunger and 7 weeks of suppressed wanting, finally breaking free, finally refusing to be contained by legal language or contractual obligations. Ledger's hand cupped her face with unexpected tenderness while his other arm pulled her closer across the seat. Marlowe's fingers tangled in his perfectly styled hair, destroying hours of careful grooming, and she tasted wine and mint and something that might have been inevitability on his lips, something that tasted like admitting what they'd both been pretending not to feel. Some distant part of her brain registered that the privacy screen was up, that the driver couldn't see them, that they had approximately 15 more minutes before reaching the penthouse. 15 minutes to decide if they were going to cross this line completely or attempt to retreat back to their careful boundaries, back to pretending this chemistry between them wasn't real, wasn't pulling them towards something their contract had been designed to prevent. Ledger pulled back just enough to meet her eyes, his breathing ragged, his pupils dilated, his careful control completely shattered. "Marlowe, don't," she whispered fiercely, terrified that if he started thinking, started analyzing, he'd remember all the reasons this was a terrible idea, why they needed to maintain their distance. "Don't think. Don't analyze what this means or how it complicates things. Just." He kissed her again before she could finish the thought, and thinking became impossible, unnecessary, irrelevant compared to the way his mouth moved against hers, the way his hands framed her face like she was something precious. They barely made it inside the penthouse before hands were everywhere, frantically removing expensive formal wear with fumbling urgency that would have been comical if it weren't so desperate. The sapphire dress that had taken Patricia 20 minutes to zip up and secure was on the marble floor in seconds, buttons from Ledger's shirt scattering like fallen stars as Marlowe wrenched it open. His jacket followed, his bow tie, his shoes kicked off somewhere near the elevator, creating a trail of designer destruction leading toward the master bedroom closer than his guest suite, closer than rational thought. That night, they broke every rule they'd established with lawyers present. Every boundary they'd drawn to protect themselves from exactly this. Every careful clause in their contract that specified emotional distance and physical separation. And in the morning, when Marlowe woke tangled in sheets that smelled like Ledger's cologne and something deeper, more fundamentally him, she knew with absolute bone-deep certainty that nothing would ever be simple again, that whatever they'd had before that careful distance, that pretense of being strangers was gone forever, shattered beyond any possibility of reconstruction. But Ledger was already gone when she reached for him, consciousness arriving with cruel clarity. No note, no message, just emptiness beside her in the bed where he'd been hours ago, and the ghost of his warmth still lingering in expensive sheets. Just silence and questions and the creeping fear that maybe last night had meant something entirely different to him than it had to her. That feeling in your chest right now, that knot of anticipation and dread mixing together, that's recognition. That's why these stories grab hold of us. Because we've all been there, haven't we? That morning after, when everything's changed but you don't know if the other person feels it too, the uncertainty that makes or breaks us. For the next 6 weeks, they didn't talk about what happened. Couldn't talk about it, maybe, or were too afraid to name what it meant and risk shattering whatever fragile thing had formed between them in the darkness of that penthouse bedroom. Ledger retreated completely into his work schedule, reverting to patterns from that first month gone before dawn broke across the city, home long after midnight had passed, avoiding Marlowe's eyes on the increasingly rare occasions their paths crossed in the vast emptiness of the penthouse. When they did encounter each other, her pouring morning coffee in the kitchen, him grabbing bottled water from the refrigerator after late-night gym sessions, they exchanged stilted pleasantries that felt more forced than the polite distance of their first month had been. Because now they both knew what they were avoiding. Now there was weight to the silence, history in the space between them. He never came to the library anymore, the space that had become their shared sanctuary, where conversations had stretched late into nights and walls had gradually crumbled, now stood empty, except for Marlowe and her books, and the ghost of what they'd been building before. That gala night had changed everything. She'd sit in her usual wingback chair, trying to read, constantly aware of the empty chair across from her where Ledger used to sit, with his wine glass and his rare, genuine smiles, and his willingness to let her see past the corporate armor. Marlowe told herself this was better, cleaner, more in line with what they'd actually agreed to. They'd broken the rules spectacularly, but they could recover, could rebuild the boundaries that were supposed to protect them both from exactly this kind of complication. They could pretend that night had never happened, could file it away as a mistake, an aberration, something alcohol and attraction and proximity had created, but didn't need to define their remaining time together. Except, her body had started betraying her in ways that made pretending increasingly impossible. The morning sickness began subtly at first, just mild queasiness when she woke, a vague, unsettled feeling in her stomach that she blamed on stress or bad food or the general anxiety of living in emotional limbo. But by the second week after the gala, the nausea had intensified into something undeniable. By the third week, Marlowe was waking at 3 a.m., stumbling to the bathroom, emptying her stomach with violent efficiency, while her hands shook and cold sweat broke out across her skin. She blamed the Thai food from the dinner she'd eaten alone the night before. Then the next morning, she blamed the leftover pasta. The morning after that, she ran out of plausible food-related excuses and had to face the cold, terrifying certainty settling in her stomach alongside the nausea. No, please, God, no. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when everything was already so impossibly complicated. But the 5 pregnancy tests she took over the course of a single morning bought from 5 different pharmacies because paranoia had convinced her that buying them all in one place would somehow make it more real, didn't care about her. Prayers or her panic or her complete unreadiness for this reality. Positive. Every single one. Bold pink lines appearing like accusations, like evidence, like futures she hadn't planned for announcing themselves in clinical certainty. Marlowe sat on the bathroom floor of the guest suite farthest from both her bedroom and Ledger's neutral territory, where discovery felt less likely, and stared at those 5 tests lined up on the marble like tiny plastic verdicts. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against her thighs to make them stop. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps that felt too close to hyperventilating. This changed everything. This obliterated whatever remained of their carefully constructed agreement. This created a permanent tie that no contract termination could sever. She needed to know for certain. Needed medical confirmation, not just drugstore tests that could potentially be wrong even though 5 false positives seemed statistically impossible. She couldn't tell Ledger until she knew for absolute certain, until she had proof she could show him. The ultrasound appointment she booked for the following week was at a clinic on the opposite side of the city, far from any neighborhood where Ledger had business or where anyone who might recognize her as his wife was likely to be. She gave them a fake name, Jessica Martinez, chosen randomly from a book she was reading, and paid cash she'd withdrawn from an ATM in small amounts over several days. The paranoia felt absurd even as she executed it, but she couldn't risk this information getting back to Ledger before she was ready, before she'd figured out how to tell him, before she'd processed what this meant. The ultrasound tech was a kind-faced woman in her 50s who'd probably performed thousands of these appointments and had seen every possible emotional reaction. She squirted cold gel on Marlowe's still flat abdomen, pressed the transducer against her skin, and within seconds, there it was on the grainy black and white screen. Not 1 heartbeat, 2 tiny flickering pulses that the tech circled with her cursor, measuring, dating, confirming. Twins, the tech said with a warm smile. Like this was wonderful news. Like this was something to celebrate, rather than a complication that would shatter an already fragile situation. Measuring in about 7 weeks. Both heartbeats are strong and healthy. Congratulations. Marlowe couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She stared at those 2 tiny spots on the screen, barely more than dots, really hardly recognizable as anything human yet, and tried to comprehend that they would become people. 2 lives that would tie her to Ledger, permanently, irrevocably. Contract be damned. 2 reasons she couldn't just take her money and disappear at the end of 6 months like they'd planned. Would you like printouts? The tech asked. Marlowe nodded numbly, unable to form words. The tech printed several copies, handed them over in an envelope, offered more congratulations that Marlowe couldn't properly respond to, and sent her on her way with instructions to schedule a follow-up appointment in 4 weeks and to start prenatal vitamins immediately. She sat in her car in the clinic parking lot for over an hour afterward, staring at those ultrasound images. 2 tiny spots that would become her children, Ledger's children. Evidence of the night they'd broken every rule. Permanent consequences of temporary passion. She had to tell him. Obviously, she had to tell him. This wasn't something she could hide, wasn't something that would resolve itself or go away if she just ignored it long enough. But every time she gathered the courage to actually do it, terror overwhelmed her completely. Ledger had been explicitly clear from the very beginning about wanting no entanglements, no emotional complications, nothing that would extend beyond their 6-month agreement. He'd constructed an entire marriage around avoiding exactly this kind of permanent connection. What could possibly be more entangling, more complicating, more permanently connecting than twin babies he'd never planned for, never wanted, never agreed to? He'd be angry. He'd feel trapped. He'd resent her for creating this situation that destroyed the clean ending they were supposed to have. He'd think she'd done this deliberately, sabotaged their contraception somehow to trap him with children as leverage for more money or a longer arrangement or whatever motives his cynicism would attribute to her. Or worse, he wouldn't be angry at all. He'd be coldly practical, offering to pay for termination or to handle everything through lawyers, treating this the way he treated every other complication, as a problem requiring efficient management and financial solutions. Marlo wasn't sure which response would hurt more, so she kept silent. Days turned into a week turned into 2. Every morning she woke nauseous. Every morning she vomited. Every morning the secret grew heavier in her chest while the babies grew in her womb, invisible to everyone but her. She avoided Ledger more carefully than he was avoiding her, taking elaborate precautions to ensure they never crossed paths. She listened for the elevator, waited until she was certain he'd left, before emerging from her wing. She ate her meals at odd hours, worked in her bedroom instead of the library, disappeared into her bathroom whenever she heard sounds suggesting he might be home. The charade couldn't last forever. She knew that. But she kept it going anyway, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty and the complete absence of any clear path forward that didn't end in destruction. The decision was taken out of her hands on a Tuesday morning 2 weeks after the ultrasound, when the nausea overwhelmed her faster than she could reach the bathroom. She'd made it as far as the kitchen, thinking maybe tea would settle her stomach, when her body revolted with zero warning. She barely made it to the sink before she was heaving violently, tears streaming down her face, too sick to care about dignity or discretion or maintaining any pretense of normalcy. That's where Ledger found her bent over the kitchen sink, retching so hard her entire body shook, mascara running down her face in dark tracks. Looking nothing like the polished woman who'd attended his gala or the composed wife their contract required her to play. "Are you okay?" The words came from directly behind her, followed immediately by his hand on her back, warm and steadying and full of genuine concern that cut through her distress. He must have been coming back from the gym, or maybe he'd never left for the office yet, or maybe the universe had simply decided this was the moment everything had to come crashing down. All the careful distance he'd maintained for 6 weeks evaporated instantly in the face of her obvious distress. This was the Ledger from the library. Before that night had complicated everything, the one who'd shared stories about his grandmother and let her see his vulnerability. The one who seemed to actually care, rather than just performing appropriate concern. Fine. Marlo managed between heaves, her voice wrecked and unconvincing. Just a stomach bug. You've had a stomach bug for 3 weeks. His hand stayed on her back, steady and warm even as she tried to pull away. His voice carried analytical precision, tempered with something softer worry, maybe, or fear. "Marlo, what's actually going on? And please don't lie to me again." She could feel the positive pregnancy tests burning in her memory, like evidence at a crime scene. Could feel the ultrasound images folded in her wallet upstairs, 2 hearts beating accusations against her every time she opened it. Could feel the weight of the secret pressing down on her like physical force, like something solid trying to crush her. "Nothing. I'm fine. Just let me." "You're lying." Not an accusation, just an observation, delivered with the certainty of someone who'd built an empire reading people and situations accurately. He studied her reflection in the stainless steel sink, seeing all the places her composure had cracked, all the tells she couldn't hide. His hand moved from her back to turn her gently to face him, and his eyes searched her face with intensity that made hiding impossible. "Talk to me, please. What's wrong?" The gentleness in that last word, the vulnerability in how he said please, destroyed every defense she'd spent 2 weeks constructing. Marlo gripped the edge of the sink, her hands white-knuckled, staring at his expensive dress shoes instead of his face, because she couldn't bear to see his expression change when she spoke the words that would ruin everything. I'm pregnant. Silence, heavy and absolute and stretching so long that Marlowe's heart began fracturing in her chest, pieces breaking off with each second that passed without response. She couldn't bring herself to look up at him, couldn't bear to see the anger or shock or betrayal that must be written across his face. She closed her eyes and kept talking, words tumbling out in desperate confession because if she stopped, she'd never find the courage again. Twins. From that night after the gala. I'm so sorry, Ledger. I know this wasn't part of the agreement. I know this complicates everything beyond repair, destroys the clean ending we were supposed to have. I don't expect anything from you. I can leave right now if you want. Sign whatever additional paperwork you need, disappear completely after the 6 months like we planned, and you'll never have to deal with me or this situation or stop. His hand found her face, fingers gentle as they tilted her chin up so she had to meet his eyes, had to see his response rather than imagining the worst. What she saw there wasn't anger or resentment or the cold practicality she'd feared. Instead, she saw something that looked almost like wonder, almost like joy, almost like the complete opposite of everything she'd been terrified of seeing. Twins? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. He wasn't bothering to hide or control. Marlowe nodded, tears spilling over and running down her cheeks in streams she couldn't stop. The doctor confirmed it yesterday, about 8 weeks along. I understand if you're angry, if you feel trapped, if you want to void the contract entirely, or I'm not angry. Ledger's other hand cupped her face now, holding her like she was something precious and fragile, something that might disappear if he didn't hold on carefully enough. His eyes searched hers with fierce intensity. Are you okay? The pregnancy, is everything all right medically? Are you sick like this every morning? Of all the responses she'd imagined, over 2 weeks of anxious catastrophizing, concern for her health hadn't made the list. Yes, most mornings. The doctor said it's normal with twins. The morning sickness can be worse, but everything else is fine. Both heartbeats are strong. They're healthy. Ledger was silent for so long that Marlowe felt her heart beginning to fracture all over again. Felt hope dying before it could fully form. Then he did something completely unexpected. Something that contradicted every assumption she'd made about how this would go. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tenderness that seemed impossible for someone who'd spent 6 weeks avoiding her, who'd built his entire life around preventing exactly this kind of emotional connection. His face pressed into her hair, and she felt him trembling slightly, felt his breath catching like he was trying to hold back something too big to contain. When he finally spoke, his voice broke on the words in a way she'd never heard before. I'm not sorry, he said, against her hair, the confession emerging raw and honest. I should be. This destroys the entire arrangement we built so carefully, complicates everything we agreed to keep simple. But Marlowe, I'm not sorry at all. She pulled back just far enough to search his face, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing, what she thought she might be seeing in his expression. What? That night, his jaw worked, emotion battling against years of practiced control, decades of teaching himself not to feel, or want, or need. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. About you. These past 6 weeks have been absolute torture, pretending nothing changed when everything changed. Trying to maintain distance when all I wanted was to cross those halls between our bedrooms and, but you left, Marlowe whispered, her voice breaking on the hurt she'd been carrying. That morning after the gala, you were just gone. No note, no word, no acknowledgement of what happened. I thought you regretted it, thought it had been a terrible mistake you wanted to forget. I regretted that I couldn't offer you more than our contract allowed. Ledger's hands framed her face, thumbs wiping away tears that wouldn't stop falling. I regretted that I'd let myself want something I had no right to want. Let myself feel things I'd sworn off feeling. I regretted that falling for you wasn't in the terms we'd agreed to, wasn't part of the business arrangement I'd convinced myself was enough. The world tilted sideways, reality reorganizing itself around information her brain couldn't quite process. Falling for me? Damn the contract. Fire blazed in his gray eyes, burning away every careful wall he'd constructed over 15 years of isolation. I've spent 15 years building walls around myself, convincing myself that isolation was strength, that feelings were weaknesses to be managed and minimized. That loving people only gave them power to destroy you when they inevitably left. Then you walked into my life with your idealism and your dog-eared books and your complete inability to be impressed by my money or intimidated by my reputation, and those walls started cracking. That night in the library when you asked if my buildings were about creating permanence, that's when I knew I was in real trouble. His forehead pressed against hers, and Marlowe could feel him trembling with the magnitude of this confession, with the vulnerability of letting her see past every defense he'd spent decades perfecting. I'm terrified, Marlowe. I don't have the first idea how to do this, relationships, family, any of it. I'll probably be terrible at all of it, but I know I don't want this to end in 3 months when the contract expires. I don't want you to leave and take whatever this is with you, and I sure as hell don't want to miss watching our children grow up. Don't want to be the kind of father who only existed in contracts and financial support rather than actual presence. What are you saying? Marlowe whispered, afraid to hope. Afraid this was stress-induced hallucination rather than reality. I'm saying forget the agreement. Forget the inheritance terms. I'll fight my grandmother's estate conditions in court if I have to. We'll deal with whatever Theron Blackwell tries to throw at me. I'm saying stay. Really stay. Not as a contract wife fulfilling obligations, but as my actual wife. Let's make this real. Marlowe kissed him before he could finish, before logic could intervene. Before fear could convince her this was temporary insanity they'd both regret later. She kissed him like she'd been wanting to for 6 weeks. Like the distance between them had been suffocating rather than protective. Like maybe they'd both been pretending very hard to want something they actually didn't. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, both trembling with emotion too big to contain, she whispered the truth she'd been hiding from herself almost as carefully as she'd hidden the pregnancy. I love you. I've been trying not to. It wasn't in the contract, wasn't part of the agreement, wasn't supposed to happen, but I love you anyway. Have probably loved you since you shared your grandmother's library with me, since you let me see past the corporate armor to the person underneath. Ledger laughed, the sound breaking on something that might have been relief or joy or disbelief that this was actually happening. Screw the contract. I love you too. Have probably been in love with you since I found you in that library curled up with Bronte like you'd found sanctuary, looking more at home, surrounded by old books than you ever looked in all this expensive emptiness. I've just been too damaged and stubborn to admit it, too convinced that wanting something made it weak, made me vulnerable in ways I couldn't afford. They stood in the kitchen holding each other, while morning light painted everything gold through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and Marlowe thought that maybe some of the best things in life were the ones that completely destroyed your carefully made plans, that shattered the safety you'd constructed, and forced you into uncertainty that turned out to be better than any certainty you'd imagined. Sometimes the hardest stories to hear, the ones that make us most uncomfortable, are the ones that show us what we're most afraid of, the risk of hoping, the danger of wanting, the vulnerability of admitting we need someone when we've convinced ourselves we're fine alone. If you've made it this far, if Marlowe and Ledger's journey is resonating in your chest like recognition, then you understand what it means to build walls that become prisons. Drop a comment if you believe real love is worth the risk. My heart chooses courage. But promises made in kitchens at dawn, Marlowe would discover over the coming weeks, were easier than living with consequences in the harsh light of public scrutiny. The next morning arrived with brutal efficiency, dragging reality back into their temporary sanctuary with unforgiving clarity. Marlowe woke wrapped in Ledger's arms, his hand still resting protectively over her stomach where their twins grew. And for approximately 30 seconds, everything felt perfect. Simple, right, in a way nothing had felt right since she'd signed those papers 2 months ago. Then she reached for him as consciousness fully returned, found emptiness beside her in the bed, and her heart dropped. He was gone. Again. Just like after the gala night. Just like every time they got close to something real, something that might actually matter beyond contracts and compensation. This time, at least, there was a note on his pillow, hastily scrawled on expensive stationery. Had to handle something at the office. Important. We'll talk tonight. Trust me. L. Trust me. As if trust could be commanded, requested, demanded through hastily written notes after disappearing without explanation. Marlowe tried not to let anxiety spiral. Tried to hold on to the memory of his words in the kitchen. I love you. I want this to be real. Stay. But doubt crept in with every minute that passed. What if morning clarity had brought regret? What if he'd woken up, remembered the magnitude of what they'd admitted, calculated the complications, and decided retreat was safer than commitment? She distracted herself with work, video calling Keisha at the bookstore to discuss inventory for the holiday season that was approaching faster than seemed possible. Tried to focus on numbers and orders and the business that had prompted this entire arrangement, but her mind kept drifting to Ledger and wherever he'd gone and what handle something actually meant. Then her phone lit up with a news alert that made her blood turn to ice. Billionaire CEO Ledger Hollingsworth files court challenge to inheritance conditions. Marlowe clicked the article with trembling fingers, dread pooling in her stomach. The piece laid everything bare with journalistic precision that felt more like autopsy than reporting. How Ledger's grandmother's will required him to be married by his 35th birthday to inherit her controlling shares in Hollingsworth Holdings. How without that inheritance, a hostile board member named Theron Blackwell, described as a ruthless corporate raider who'd been circling the company for years, was positioned to take over the empire. Ledger had spent 15 years building from his grandmother's foundation. How Ledger's recent marriage to relative unknown Marlowe Sinclair had seemed suspiciously timed, occurring mere weeks before the inheritance deadline. How he was now challenging the will's marital requirement in court, claiming his marriage was legitimate regardless of the inheritance requirements, essentially daring anyone to prove it wasn't real. The article stopped just short of outright calling Marlowe a gold digger hired to play a role, but the implications saturated every paragraph. Speculation about how much she'd been paid, questions about whether the marriage was a sham designed solely to secure billions in inheritance, suggestions that this court challenge was damage control now that someone, possibly Theron himself, had started asking uncomfortable questions. Her phone rang before she'd finished reading. The screen showing Sterling's name. Her brother. Her little brother, who'd always looked up to her, who'd believed she made good decisions, who'd trusted her judgment even when circumstances seemed impossible. She answered with a sense of impending devastation. Sterling, Marlowe, please tell me this isn't what it looks like. His voice was tight with something between concern and disappointment, every word landing like a blow. Please tell me you didn't marry a billionaire as some kind of contract arrangement for money. Her silence was answer enough. Damning. Complete. Jesus. Marlowe. Sterling's disappointment, cut deeper than anger would have, carved out spaces in her chest that immediately filled with shame. Disappointment from her little brother who'd always believed she was better than this, stronger than this. Incapable of the kind of desperation that led to selling yourself in designer clothes. Is that how you got the money for the bookstore? You sold yourself to save Dad's legacy? It's not like that, it's more complicated than. Then what is it like? Because from here, it looks like you let some rich guy buy you like property. Like you put a price on yourself and he paid it. How is that different from, he stopped himself, but the unspoken word hung between them anyway. Prostitution. That's what he'd been about to say. Sterling, listen to me. It started as a contract. Yes, I won't lie about that. But it's become real. We're in love. We're having, she stopped herself before saying twins. Before revealing information Ledger deserved to share with family on his own terms, not through her defensive explanations to her disappointed brother. In love? Sterling's laugh was bitter, disbelieving. You've known him for what, 2 months? And most of that under a fake arrangement? That's not love, Marlowe. That's Stockholm Syndrome. That's you convincing yourself you feel something to justify what you did. You don't understand? No, I don't. Because the sister I knew wouldn't have done this. The sister I knew had pride, had dignity, had enough self-respect to find another way. But apparently I didn't know you as well as I thought. The call ended before Marlowe could respond, before she could explain, before she could defend choices. She wasn't entirely sure she could defend anyway. The silence after the disconnection felt heavier than sound, filled with all the things she'd wanted to say but hadn't found words for. More calls came throughout the day, each one progressively worse. A friend from college asking if the rumors were true, voice carefully neutral in a way that suggested she'd already decided they were. A distant cousin wondering if Marlowe could introduce her to some of Ledger's friends with implications so obvious they didn't need stating. A reporter who'd somehow gotten her number, asking for comment on the nature of your financial arrangement with Mr. Hollingsworth. Marlo turned her phone off after the fifth call. Sitting alone in the enormous penthouse that suddenly felt more like a prison than a home, surrounded by luxury that now seemed like evidence of her moral compromise rather than fairy tale transformation. When Ledger finally came home that evening, earlier than his usual return, but later than she'd hoped, later than "we'll talk tonight," had implied she was waiting in the library, their library. The space where they'd first started becoming real to each other, where walls had begun crumbling before either admitted what was happening. "I had to get ahead of it," Ledger said immediately upon seeing her, reading her expression with the accuracy of someone who'd spent his adult life analyzing situations and calculating responses. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his normally immaculate hair disheveled from repeated hand-raking. "Theron's been investigating us. He's known for weeks that something about our marriage timing seemed too convenient. Filing the court challenge was the only way to prove the marriage is real and legitimate, not a sham constructed purely for inheritance purposes. It removes his ammunition before he can use it to challenge my position." "Is it real?" Marlo asked quietly, hating that she had to ask, hating the doubt that Sterling's call had planted, hating how quickly certainty from this morning had dissolved into questions. Because last night felt real. This morning felt like damage control and legal strategy. Ledger moved toward her, but she held up a hand, stopping him before he could touch her, before physical proximity could cloud the clarity she desperately needed. "My brother called. He saw the news. Everyone's seen the news by now. The whole world knows I married you under questionable circumstances, knows there was money involved, knows this probably started as exactly the kind of arrangement everyone's speculating about. Everyone thinks I'm a gold digger who sold herself, and maybe they're right. Maybe that's exactly what I am. Don't." Ledger's voice turned sharp with something that might have been pain. "Don't reduce what we have to a transaction just because other people can't see past surface appearances." "Then what is it?" Marlo stood. Anger and hurt and pregnancy hormones, combining into volatile emotion she couldn't fully control. "Because you said you loved me. You said you wanted this to be real, but your first move this morning was calling your attorneys instead of talking to your pregnant wife. Your first instinct was legal strategy and damage control, not honesty or partnership or any of the things real marriages are supposed to involve." "I'm trying to protect you," Ledger protested, reaching for her again. "Theron will come after you directly if he thinks there's any weakness in our marriage, any crack he can exploit. The court challenge establishes that our relationship is legitimate regardless of the inheritance, that I'm willing to fight for you publicly. It removes his leverage before he can weaponize it against either of us." "I don't need protection." Marlo's voice broke, and she hated how weak she sounded, how much this hurt. "I need honesty. I need to know if you're with me because you actually love me, or because I'm conveniently carrying your heirs. Because right now, 12 hours after you said all those beautiful things in the kitchen, it feels like those babies are the only reason you're not running for the hills." The question hung between them like an accusation, like a test, like something with weight enough to crush what they'd been building if answered wrong. Ledger's jaw worked, and for one terrible moment, Marlo thought he might not answer at all, might let silence confirm her worst fears. Then he moved so fast, she gasped, closing the distance between them in 2 strides and pulling her against him with desperate intensity that contradicted every careful boundary they'd maintained for months. "I'm with you because the thought of losing you makes me unable to breathe properly," he said fiercely, his hands cupping her face so she couldn't look away, couldn't miss the raw honesty in his eyes. "Because these past 2 months have been the first time since my grandmother died that this penthouse has felt like a home instead of a mausoleum I happen to sleep in. Because when I imagine the future, any future, it's your face I see, your voice I hear, your presence that makes everything else make sense." His forehead pressed against hers, and she could feel him trembling with the magnitude of this confession. "Yes, I'm terrified about becoming a father to twins I never planned for. Yes, I handled this morning badly. I defaulted to legal strategies when I got scared, because contracts feel safer than feelings, because I've spent 15 years teaching myself that vulnerability is weakness. But Marlo, you have to believe me. I would want you even if there were no babies. I would fight for you even if there were no inheritance at stake, no company to protect, no external pressures forcing decisions. You've become the permanent thing I've been building toward my entire life without even knowing what I was searching for." Tears streamed down Marlo's face, but this time they felt different. Less like grief, more like release. I'm scared too. Scared this is too good to be true. Scared you'll wake up one day and regret the mess we've made of your carefully organized life. Scared I'm not enough, not sophisticated enough, not polished enough, not from the right world to actually be what you need long term. Then we'll be scared together. Ledger kissed her softly, thoroughly, like he was sealing a promise rather than just expressing desire. No more contracts dictating terms. No more clauses protecting us from feeling. Just us, figuring it out as we go, making mistakes and fixing them, being imperfect and human and real together. She wanted to believe him, desperately wanted to trust that this morning's legal maneuvering had been protection rather than retreat, strategy rather than second-guessing. But belief, she was learning, required more than words. It required proof built over time, consistency that actions demonstrated rather than promises asserted. The court challenge became a media circus that made their previous privacy look quaint by comparison. Paparazzi camped outside their building in shifts, 24-hour surveillance hoping to catch unflattering moments or evidence of marital discord. Tabloids ran speculative pieces daily about Marlowe's background, painting her as everything from a cunning seductress who deliberately trapped a billionaire to a naive victim being used for his inheritance scheme. They dug up her college photos, analyzed her social media history, interviewed people she'd barely known who suddenly had opinions about her character and motives. The bookstore, her grandfather's legacy, the thing she'd sacrificed so much to save, became a pilgrimage site for gossip seekers and curiosity hunters taking selfies in front of the building, treating her family's 100-year history like a tourist attraction. She had to temporarily close the doors for the safety of both staff and customers, watching via security cameras as photographers staked out the entrance, hoping to catch her visiting. Through it all, Ledger was steady in ways she hadn't fully expected. He held her hand at every court appearance, facing down cameras with her beside him as though she belonged there, as though their love was so obvious that questioning it was absurd. He issued public statements calling her the love of my life, with such conviction that even cynical reporters seemed to soften slightly, seemed to consider that maybe this was more than convenient arrangement. At night, when the scrutiny and stress felt overwhelming, he held her in their now shared bed, hands splayed protectively across her stomach where the twins were growing despite the chaos, whispering promises about the life they'd build together once this circus ended. But the stress was taking a physical toll that terrified them both. At 12 weeks pregnant, Marlowe woke to find blood spotting her underwear. Not much, just enough to send cold terror flooding through her entire body, just enough to make her stumble out of bed gasping Ledger's name before her knees gave out. The emergency room visit lasted 6 hours. 6 hours of ultrasounds and blood tests and worried looks from medical professionals who kept using phrases like threatened miscarriage and high-risk twin pregnancy and significant maternal stress factors. 6 hours of Ledger's hand crushing hers while they both stared at monitors, showing two tiny hearts still beating, still fighting, still holding on despite circumstances trying to shake them loose. Complete bed rest, the doctor finally said, her expression serious as she made notes in Marlowe's chart. Minimum 1 month, possibly longer, depending on how things progress. Twin pregnancies are high risk, even under ideal circumstances. Add in your stress levels and elevated blood pressure, and we're looking at significant complications if we don't intervene aggressively now. No work, no stress, no physical activity beyond bathroom trips. You need to treat this like a medical emergency, because that's what it is. Ledger canceled all meetings before they'd even left the hospital, cleared his schedule completely, sent emails delegating responsibilities he'd never delegated before, trusting lieutenants he'd spent years training for exactly this kind of situation. He worked from their bedroom, laptop on the floor beside the bed where Marlowe was now confined, taking conference calls while holding her hand, refusing to be more than arm's reach away for longer than absolutely necessary. You need to go to the office, Marlowe told him one afternoon, watching him pace while on a video call with his board, his energy filling the room in ways that made her feel simultaneously comforted and claustrophobic. The company needs you there in person. I'm fine. I'm literally just lying here reading. You're climbing the walls, and that stress is probably worse for the babies than you being gone for a few hours. Ledger ended the call and sat carefully on the edge of the bed, taking her hand with such gentle precision, like she might shatter if he applied too much pressure. When I was 8 years old and my parents died in that car accident, I was in the car too, he said quietly, and Marlowe realized this was territory he'd never fully explored before. Trauma he'd mentioned, but never excavated. I was in the back seat with my headphones on, completely absorbed in some handheld video game that seemed desperately important at the time. I didn't see the truck run the red light, didn't see the impact coming, but I heard this sound like the world ending, metal crushing and glass shattering, and my mother screaming my father's name. His voice fractured slightly, and Marlowe squeezed his hand, giving him time to collect himself, to decide how much of this old wound he was ready to expose. I survived without a scratch, not a single injury. They died instantly, the impact. Killed my father immediately. My mother within minutes, despite the paramedics' efforts. And I learned, in the most brutal way an 8-year-old can learn, that the people you love can be taken from you in a heartbeat, with zero warning, with no chance to prepare or protect them, or even say goodbye properly. That presence means nothing when fate, or chance, or random circumstance decides otherwise. He looked at her with eyes haunted by grief, 3 decades old, but still sharp, still cutting. So forgive me if I'm paranoid about leaving you alone for even a few hours. Forgive me if I'd rather risk the company than risk not being here if something goes wrong. I know it's irrational. I know statistically my presence doesn't affect outcomes, but I cannot lose you or them. Not when I've finally let myself want something, need someone, imagine a future that matters more than quarterly earnings. Marlowe pulled him down beside her on the bed, holding him as decades of suppressed trauma finally surfaced in gasping sobs he'd probably never allowed himself before. This man who'd spent his adult life building walls to protect against exactly this kind of vulnerability was finally letting them crumble completely, finally trusting her with the deepest wounds he carried. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, running her fingers through his hair, feeling him tremble against her. "We're not going anywhere. These babies are fighters. They have your stubborn determination after all. They're not giving up. I'm not giving up. We're all going to be fine." He laughed wetly against her shoulder. "And they have your idealistic refusal to accept limitations. Our poor children don't stand a chance with that genetic combination." The court ruled in Ledger's favor 3 days before Marlowe's 13-week ultrasound brought the news that made everything else seem trivial by comparison. The judge determined that the marriage, while initially contractual in nature, had clearly evolved into a legitimate romantic partnership, evidenced by the couple's pregnancy, cohabitation, and public demonstration of mutual affection. Theron Blackwell was ordered to cease all interference with company operations. The inheritance was secure. The legal battle was over. Ledger barely glanced at the verdict notification on his phone. He was too focused on the ultrasound screen in the dimly lit exam room, holding Marlowe's hand so tightly she could feel his pulse racing through his palm, watching 2 tiny shapes that had grown substantially more human-looking since that 7-week scan. "They're okay?" He asked the technician for the 3rd time in 10 minutes, leaning forward like he could will the babies to be healthy through sheer force of concentration. "Everything looks normal? Nothing concerning?" "They're perfect," the technician assured him with the patient smile of someone who dealt with anxious, expectant fathers daily. "Strong heartbeats, listen. You can hear them now." She turned on the audio, and suddenly the room filled with the rapid whooshing sounds of 2 hearts beating in perfect synchrony. "Good growth patterns, appropriate development for gestational age, no abnormalities visible. Whatever you've been doing this past month is working beautifully." Marlowe watched Ledger stare at that screen with an expression of such pure, unguarded awe that her own eyes filled with tears. This man who had convinced himself he was too damaged for family, too broken for the kind of love that made you vulnerable, was looking at their children like they'd personally hung every star in the sky just for him. "Can you print extra copies of the images?" he asked suddenly, still unable to look away from the screen. "I want to frame one for my office." "Ledger," Marlowe laughed through tears. "You can't put ultrasound photos in your CEO office. Watch me." His grin was unrepentant, boyish, more genuine than any expression she'd seen on his face in all their time together. "Theron tried to take my company and made you close the bookstore and stressed you until you were spotting. I'm absolutely petty enough to plaster my office with evidence of exactly what he failed to destroy. But when they got home, he tucked the ultrasound photos into his wallet instead, pulling them out repeatedly throughout the evening to stare at them like they were precious artifacts rather than grainy medical images, like he still couldn't quite believe they were real. What we do in these moments when everything we thought was certain suddenly shifts beneath us says everything about who we actually are beneath the roles we play. Ledger and Marlowe could have stuck to their contract, could have maintained comfortable distance, could have protected themselves from exactly this kind of messy, complicated, beautiful reality. But instead, they chose to leap into uncertainty together. Have you ever had to make that choice between safe and real? That night, as they lay tangled together in bed, with his hand resting on her growing bump, Marlowe asked the question that had been haunting her since that morning in the lawyer's office felt like a lifetime ago. Do you regret it, the contract? How we started? Would you change it if you could go back knowing what you know now? Ledger was silent for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then his voice came through the darkness, rough with honesty that cost him something to voice. I regret that I wasted those first 7 weeks pretending I didn't want you, maintaining distance when every evening in the library made me want to cross those invisible boundaries we'd drawn. I regret that I was too emotionally constipated to just ask you on a normal date like a normal person, that I had to construct this elaborate legal fiction because the thought of risking rejection felt more terrifying than commodifying marriage. He paused, his hand pressing firmer against her stomach where their twins were growing in the darkness. But the contract brought you into my life when nothing else would have. It gave me you, gave me them, gave me this chance to stop hiding behind walls and actually build something that matters more than architecture or quarterly earnings. I think your grandmother would have liked me, Marlowe said softly, thinking of that library 1 floor below them, preserved exactly as the woman who'd raised him had arranged it. I think she would have approved of how we destroyed your perfectly organized life. She would have loved you, Ledger corrected, kissing her temple with such tenderness it made her chest ache. And she would have said it was about damn time someone broke through my walls. She used to tell me that the best buildings require strong foundations, and ours was built on pretty shaky ground initially. It's getting stronger, though, Marlowe murmured, already drifting towards sleep with his warmth surrounding her, his steady heartbeat beneath her ear serving as lullaby. Yes, he agreed, holding her close as the city lights glittered beyond their windows like promises. Yes, it definitely is. 4 months later, Marlowe went into labor 3 weeks early on a Tuesday afternoon while she was folding laundry in the bedroom. 3 weeks early, which the doctor had warned was common with twins, but still felt like a betrayal of her carefully planned timeline that had her making it to at least 37 weeks. Ledger, who had remained calm and controlled through billion-dollar deals and hostile takeovers, who had faced down boardrooms and photographers and legal challenges without his composure cracking, completely fell apart the moment she said, I think my water just broke. He forgot the hospital bag they'd packed weeks earlier, carefully positioned by the door for exactly this moment. Ran 2 red lights getting to the hospital, earning angry honks from other drivers that he completely ignored. Nearly got into a physical confrontation with a nurse, who made the mistake of suggesting he might want to wait in the lobby during the initial examination, because his pacing was creating disruptive energy in the birthing. Sweet. I'm not leaving her, he snarled with such fierce protectiveness that even the attending physician backed up slightly. I don't care about your energy concerns or your protocols or your comfort. I'm staying right here with my wife. 22 hours later, 22 hours of labor that tested every physical and emotional limit, Marlowe-possessed Wren Eloise Hollingsworth arrived, screaming her displeasure at the world with such volume that nurses 3 doors down could hear her protest. She had Marlowe's dark curls already visible despite being minutes old, Ledger's gray eyes that would probably lighten over time but were currently unfocused and wide, and lungs that suggested she'd inherited both parents' stubborn refusal to be silenced. 6 minutes after that, her brother Caspian James emerged with considerably less drama, as though birth were just another scheduled appointment rather than a major life event. He had Ledger's coloring in Marlowe's mouth and an expression of calm curiosity that suggested he was already taking mental notes on this strange new world he'd been thrust into. Ledger held them both, one in each arm, tears streaming unashamedly down his face, while he stared at them like they'd performed a miracle just by existing. They're perfect, he kept repeating, voice breaking on the words. Marlowe, they're absolutely perfect. Look at them. Just look at them. She watched this powerful man who had built an empire, who commanded respect from world leaders and board members, and everyone who'd ever heard his name completely shattered and remade by two 6-pound humans who'd existed for less than 10 minutes. His transformation was the most beautiful thing she'd ever witnessed, more profound than any love, confession, or grand gesture. This was him letting himself be vulnerable in a way no amount of therapy or encouragement could have accomplished. This was love stripping away every protective layer until only truth remained. "You're going to be an amazing father," Marlo whispered, exhausted beyond words but unable to look away from the picture they made her husband and their babies. The family she'd accidentally created while trying to save a different legacy. He looked at her with eyes shining with tears and wonder and overwhelming love that seemed too big to be contained by one person. "Only because you taught me what family actually means." "Only because you refused to let me hide behind contracts and conditions, and all the ways I'd convinced myself isolation was safer than connection." 6 months later, on what would have been their contract expiration date, the day they were supposed to sign dissolution papers and walk away from each other, like the previous 6 months had been a brief detour rather than a complete life, Reorganization Ledger surprised Marlo with a renewal ceremony. Not a vow renewal, because they'd never spoken real vows at that courthouse wedding that had been more transaction than commitment. This was their actual wedding, the one that mattered. The one where they chose each other without contracts or inheritance pressures or any external force compelling their commitment. They stood before family and friends in the library where their walls had first started crumbling, where conversations about books and buildings had slowly transformed into conversations about vulnerability and permanence and what it meant to let yourself need someone. Sterling stood as Marlo's witness, having slowly come around once he'd seen how Ledger looked at his sister, how he'd stood by her through media scrutiny and pregnancy complications, and every difficulty their unusual beginning had created. Wren fussed in Sterling's arms, making her opinions known about being held by someone other than her parents. While Caspian slept peacefully in the bassinet, Patricia was gently rocking, completely unbothered by the ceremony happening around him. They spoke vows they'd written themselves, real promises this time, not legal obligations. Promises about choosing each other daily, about building together rather than parallel, about letting fear make them brave instead of isolated. About raising their children to know that love worth having is love worth fighting for, especially when it starts from unlikely places. As Ledger slipped a new ring on her finger, not the practical band from the courthouse ceremony, but an heirloom from his grandmother, the woman who taught him about permanence and love and the courage required for both, he whispered words, meant only for her ears. "Best contract I ever signed." Marlo laughed through happy tears, glancing at their children who represented everything they'd never planned for, everything the contract was supposed to prevent. "Worst negotiation skills I ever demonstrated. I should have asked for way more than 6 months." "I disagree," he murmured, pulling her close as their small gathering applauded. And Wren's fussing escalated into full protest. "We both got everything we never knew we needed. You got your bookstore saved and 2 kids you didn't plan for. I got a wife who sees past my money to the broken parts I tried so hard to hide. We got messy and complicated and real instead of clean and simple and fake." And in that library, filled with his grandmother's books, surrounded by the family they'd accidentally built from a contract meant to prevent exactly this kind of emotional entanglement, Marlo realized he was absolutely right. Sometimes the best things in life were the ones you never saw coming. The ones that completely destroyed your carefully made plans and forced you to build something better from the rubble. Sometimes love required no contract at all, just courage, trust, and 2 people willing to rewrite the terms together when the original agreement stopped serving the truth of what they'd become. Their story hadn't started like a fairy tale. It had started like a business deal, cold and transactional and designed to end cleanly. But that's the thing about the human heart. It doesn't respect contracts or conditions or carefully drawn boundaries meant to protect you from feeling. It wants what it wants, builds what it builds, loves what it loves, completely disregarding the terms initially agreed upon. The walls we build to protect ourselves, Marlo had learned, often become the very prisons we need someone else to break us out of. The safety we construct turns into isolation if we're not careful, if we let fear of loss prevent us from ever having something worth losing. I wonder if you'll remember this story tomorrow, or if it'll fade like so many others we consume and forget. But if you've made it this far, through contracts and courtrooms, through pregnancy scares and public scrutiny, through all the messy, Complicated ways love breaks down our defenses and rebuilds us into something stronger. Then something in this story grabbed hold of you. Trust that instinct. These stories we share aren't just entertainment. They're mirrors, reflecting our own hopes and fears back at us with unforgiving clarity. They're permission slips to want things we're afraid to want, to take risks we're terrified to take, to believe that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings. Every story we ignore is a lesson we miss, a truth we refuse to see. But you're still here, which means you get it. You understand that walls can be climbed, that contracts can be rewritten, that love is always more complicated and more powerful than we planned for it to be. Marlowe and Ledger's journey began with signatures on legal documents, with negotiated terms and predetermined endings. It could have stayed that way, clean, simple, emotionally safe. But they chose messiness over safety, chose risking heartbreak over guaranteeing isolation, chose building something real over maintaining something controlled. And that choice, that daily decision to stay vulnerable even when fear screamed at them to retreat, made all the difference. So here's my final question for you. By the end of this story, are you someone who acts on what moves them, or someone who just observes and moves on unchanged? Which are you? Because the answer to that question determines more than whether you hit like or subscribe. It determines whether you let stories change you or just pass through you without leaving marks. If this story reached into your chest and grabbed something tender, if Marlowe and Ledger's transformation from strangers to lovers to family resonated like truth, then don't let this feeling fade. Share it with someone who needs to hear that it's okay to want things that scare you, that it's okay to take risks when safety starts feeling more like suffocation, that it's okay to let someone past your walls, especially when every instinct says to keep them at arm's length. Like this video if you believe love is worth the risk. Share it if you know someone who needs permission to hope. Subscribe if you want more stories about the messy, complicated, beautiful ways we save each other from our own isolation. Thank you for trusting me with your time and attention for the past 2 hours. Thank you for staying through every complication and setback. Thank you for believing, even when the characters themselves didn't believe, that love was possible for people this damaged, this afraid, this convinced they were better off alone. Until the next story, remember, the walls we build to protect ourselves are sometimes the very things preventing us from finding what we're actually looking for. And sometimes the best contracts are the ones we have the courage to break when they stop serving the truth of what we've become. Drop a comment. My heart believes in real love. Let me see that this story touched you the way it touched me telling it.